Live. Okay.
If you notice my face freezing too, that nothing's affected on my phone, so I can hear the conversation still perfectly and respond. So if my image freezes, that's not a problem. At least
Okay,
audio-wise.
good. And we're not on video. We're just on audio. Okay, let's see. Is this working? Live. This is working. Good. Okay.
If you notice my face freezing too,
Live.
that nothing.
So I'm just going to take a look and make sure that we're on track with everything. Yep, I'm going to share this to a group of people. Oh, whoops. What's going on? No, okay, that's fine. All right, and so let's see if I think it should be working on Facebook as well. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a moment. I hope you got a couple of people engaged. Look like it's working on Facebook. Oh, wow. It's even got live captions being generated on Facebook. What a funny thing. All right. So I think that we're on track. And welcome, everyone. My name's Daniel Burke. This is a conversation program that Cade, Levinson, and I have organized. We call it On Learned Ignorance, which is a reference to our favorite Nicholas of Cusa. And we're having a conversation today with William Jones, Bill Jones, who is a 50-year associate of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. He's a tremendous contributor to the fight for an age of reason for humanity, and we're really happy to have a chance to talk to him. He is the Washington Bureau Chief for Executive Intelligence Review. He's also a non-resident fellow of the Chongyang Institute. I'm sorry, I'm for finance, right? Excuse me, yeah.
Financial studies.
Of financial studies, thank you. And Bill has written a lot about. Well, let me just say, welcome, Bill. Hi.
Hi. Good to see you all.
Yeah, it's good. Really glad to have this conversation because the point is that Cade and I are really interested in the specific question of what is China as a civilization, what is 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party from the standpoint of Lyndon LaRouche's method of historical inquiry, of economics, physical economics, and in terms of our passion for the future of humanity, that U.S., China, and all nations can collaborate to build modern health infrastructure in every country immediately, which is what the chairwoman, Helga LaRouche of the Schiller Institute, the leader of the International LaRouche movement, has been absolutely focused on. It's what we're really committed to. If we want to be able to achieve that kind of breakthrough, to address these grave crisis, the conjunctural crisis that we're in, which LaRouche forecast, we need to understand China, the most successful nation in its opposition to the British Empire's policy of zero growth, population reduction. So I'm just going to mention a couple of topics that I think would be really fun to talk about, and then Cade is going to mention a couple of topics that he'd like to hear about, and then we will really like to hear from you, Bill, and go on as long as you choose to in describing it. So here's a couple of things that were on my mind. Within that framing that I just referred to. Cade and I both prepared for this conversation by reading an article that Bill wrote on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, as well as a couple of other major articles that he's written. One in 2018, and we'll put these in the comments section or the description. One in 2018, published in EIR, about U.S.-China, the history of U.S.-China relations, which deals a lot with figure named Burlingame, who was the first, who was involved in establishing the first really decent treaty between the United States and China. And then we also read an article from him on Schiller's influence, the influence of Friedrich Schiller's thought in revolutionary China. So here are a couple of things that I'm interested in. One is, I'm familiar with the fact that at the beginning of the Communist Party, in this revolutionary period, there were efforts by the British, specifically by Lord Bertrand Russell, also by their associates, the House of Morgan, in financing the trips of John Dewey, the American pragmatist, who a lot of people are talking about right now as though he were someone decent, and he is not. And so there were a lot of efforts also by Joseph Needham, who had been deployed by the Fabian Socialists, based on my understanding, into China, to pervert the understanding of Western epistemology, so to speak, within China, and to shape the epistemology of the revolutionary movement in China. So I'm interested in your perspective on that, mainly from the standpoint of the incredible successes of the Chinese Communist Party over these 100 years, and particularly in the recent 40 years. To what extent were those influences negative? And I have a few things I can share later to pop in there, some quotes about Dewey and about Russell. To what degree were these people successful in getting the Chinese revolutionary leaders to adopt an outlook that was compatible with the zero growth British imperial outlook? And to what extent were they, or in other words, why was that defeated? How is it that the Chinese had the power to overcome that, seeing as that's what we need to do in the United States? We need to overcome the corruption of our own culture by those very axioms that Bertrand Russell and John Dewey represent. So that's a big question that I have. And then in addition, I want to ask, where did Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai come from? Because I see the distinction in their contributions. I would love to hear from you what your perspective is on those two figures and on their origins, so to speak, their shaping. I'd like to talk about the actual unique revolutionary characteristic of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought, so to speak. I'd like to hear from you about why it is that China has been successful in profound technological and scientific breakthroughs, such as the space program, such as the development of atomic weapons and atomic energy, and then finally, sort of to bring it back to the whole, I'm really asking, what is the role of the LaRouches, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, over the past 40 years, 50 years, and into today, and your own role. For people who don't know this, Bill has a column in CGTN like 4 times a month. He's doing a tremendous job of presenting his own view and the view of a person who thinks from LaRouche's standpoint about what can be done in today's world. So what is it that our movement, the International LaRouche Movement, can do? What's our role vis-a-vis China? So those are some things I wanted to bring up.
That is a big agenda.
Yeah, it is. Excuse me. Yeah. Excuse me.
I'm happy to. Let me start with how the Communist Party sees itself.
Please.
Today. And this is, I think, expressed in the recent 6th plenum of the Politburo, which issued statements with regard to their view on history. And it's, in one sense, it's a revision, but also an enhancement. Now, there have been 3 of these things, of these historical outlooks in the history of the Communist Party. One was in 1949, where the Communist Party made it clear that the road for socialism is the road for China, putting that as the basis of the agenda. Secondly, it was after the reform and opening up, where the ideas of Deng Xiaoping, how China would now be open to the world, would be a part of the world economy, would communicate with the other countries. This was then the second view of history, that this is the direction that China will go. And now you have the third view, really consolidates what they call Xi Jinping thought, which is characterized by a continued reform and opening up, that is, a reform and opening up to the world, but also a clear indication and message to the world that China is pursuing the path of becoming what they call a modern socialist economy by 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. And that's a message which is important because a lot of people think that China opening up means that they're going to become, like us. In one sense, they adopt a lot of things we have, but China is China. And they have their own culture, which is more determinant in terms of the direction that they're going. Now, how does that have effect on the history of the Communist Party? The Communist Party, like many other parties, was a result of turbulence within China. A revolution had occurred. The Republic of China had replaced the Qing dynasty, but it was still very chaotic with the warlords fighting each other. And of course, when the Bolshevik Revolution was successful, then this sent a message to some of the Chinese that we should follow their lead, and maybe we would be successful in accomplishing this. And they did form the Communist Party in 1921. A very small group of people, a handful really, 20 people or so, who were at this conference. Didn't look like it would be much, but it was in a period of tremendous turmoil. And the initial phase of what they were doing had them allied with the grouping of Sun Yat-sen, who was considered the father, rightfully so, the father of modern China, the first president of the Republic of China, who wanted to transform China and in particular to institute a land reform. The orientation, when you look at China, you have to understand that this is largely a agricultural peasant-based country, or has been, still is to a large extent. And that anything that would occur in terms of transforming it had to take consideration to, the role of the peasantry there. So that they, and this was the idea that Sun Yat-sen had, who himself tried to organize a major land reform as the basis of the so-called three principles of the people. But the Communist Party allied themselves with the grouping around Sun Yat-sen because they believed that China is not going to become immediately socialist, but it has to be transformed, it has to be industrialized, and that this bourgeois revolution has got to occur before there's a socialist revolution. So they were integral in the initial fight for creating a national republic, and in what happened historically was that Sun Yat-sen's forces were grouped in the south. They had to take the rest of the country, so that there was a move, a military move to take all the northern part of the country and to consolidate control over the nation as a whole. And the Communist Party were part of that. And when Sun died, of course, this idea, two things died with him. Excuse me. It was the orientation towards the peasantry, in my morning voice, towards the peasantry, and the other was the alliance with the Communist Party. And as Chiang Kai-shek was moving north, Shanghai was being taken by the trade unionists, who had had a strike and took over the city in order to hand it over to the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, on the other hand, was making deals with the landlords He was making deals with the international community, which was strong, very, very strong in Shanghai, controlled a large part of Shanghai. And that meant that he had to move against the striking workers, which were the landlords were not happy with, the merchants were not happy with, and the international community was not happy with. So there was a massacre by a group called the Green Gang, a mafia group active in Shanghai, and killed many thousands of workers. And that was the end of the alliance. So the Communist Party then went on their own. They did set up in spite of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek was trying to decimate them, to eliminate them from the political arena. They did their so-called long march of thousands of miles through the roughest terrain you've ever seen to a safe haven in the north at the time when the Japanese were moving against Manchuria and prepared to take over portions of China. So that the Chinese Communist Party, which then had an independent role, set up their independent battle against the Japanese forces long before Chiang Kai-shek and the government of China decided that there was a war against Japan. And so in this independent role, of course, they were very successful in conducting guerrilla strikes against the Japanese. They won their spurs in that. There was an attempt after the war, which was mediated by the United States, or was pushed by the United States, of bringing the two sides together to have a unified China. The Communist Party was prepared to do this. Chiang Kai-shek was really not prepared to do that. And some of the key issues, and we don't have to go into it, with who's going to control the military forces? Will the Communist Party have their own military forces? And of course, they were not amenable to that, given what Chiang Kai-shek had done, in Shanghai and had tried to do even before World War II in destroying the Communist Party. And so there was a civil war. The forces of the Kuomintang, or Chiang Kai-shek's party, were much more powerful than the Chinese forces. But the Chinese forces had, during the course of the war, actually really won the mandate of heaven. That is, their attitude toward the peasantry, toward the areas which they were in control of, showed that they really wanted to lift the population up, whereas Chiang Kai-shek still had the old methods of the warlords in organizing his own armies. There was a lot of resentment for that. And it was basically because of that, rather than any military backing, people will say, from the Soviets. They did get the weapons that the Soviets took in Manchuria when they finally moved towards the end of the war into Manchuria, did fall into communist hand. But basically, it was the creation, it was the attachment that they were able to successfully make with the Chinese people, including the Chinese rural areas. They did set up a government. Initially, the government was very open. They tried to bring in a lot of the elements that were non-communist. Other parties, when it was founded, other parties were also existing in China, although that the role of the Communist Party was key. And there were sometimes problems with this because the Kuomintang initially still controlled parts of the country. There were all kinds of destabilizing operations going on after the People's Republic of China had been formed. And there was really still a state of war, largely because the U.S. was giving backing to Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan, and they were making attacks on the Chinese coast and aerial bombings in mainland China at the time. That they tightened up the control, and we had, it was back and forth in terms of the role of the other party. But they did create a system of what they call consultative democracy. That is, they felt, I think rightly so, that it was the role of the Communist Party to put things together again, to create, the nation of China, but that the other parties that were in existence, including a KMT, a Kuomintang party that remained, loyal to the country when the split came, and loyal to Sun's ideas were also a part of this mix. And so you had the formation of this People's Republic of China. It was basically isolated. There were very few countries that made inroads. Interestingly enough, the British always doing this. When the Americans make mistakes, the Americans put their money on Chiang Kai-shek and they never abandoned him. The British, however, tried to make inroads into the Chinese, with whom they had contact dating back to the visit that you mentioned of Russell, which was set up by John Dewey. John Dewey made the introduction, having Russell come into China.
Really?
So they were really working together on this thing. Now, what was the attitude of the Chinese Communist Party at the time? I say philosophically, what did you have there? And it was really kind of a mixed bag. What I always emphasize is the fact that a lot of the Chinese communists went abroad during World War I. China, in spite of the objections of Sun Yat-sen, did join the Allied effort. But what they did was not, send their troops and engage in combat, but they sent their workers to work in the industries. When the French, soldiers were recruited and sent into the army, and then Chinese workers came in, and they worked there. But they also studied, and there was a study program set up largely earlier by a famous Chinese educator named Tsai Ing-wen, who was very close to Sun Yat-sen. He was always a part of the Kuomintang of the Sun Yat-sen's party, even after the split. But he brought in to his institute. Tsai Ing-wen also studied abroad. This is the important thing you got to say of the mix of these different groups, is the different Western influences coming into China. And he studied in Germany, and he was very much taken by the work of Friedrich Schiller, especially the aesthetic letters. And he felt, knowing China and being a Confucian scholar himself, he felt that what Schiller had to offer was also something that could be brought in to the Chinese culture in order to create, a sense of nationhood and a sense of responsibility to the nation, which wasn't always the case in China. By introducing the notion of giving them a sense of beauty. And so he came back and introduced this aesthetic education to the Chinese educational system. And he actually invited scholars to be a part of this group at Peking University, which included the two people who later, founded the Communist Party. So obviously, the Schiller influence on them was not quite as strong as it was on Tsai Ing-wen. But the whole thing was very much a mixed bag. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that also Tsai also set up this program of having Chinese students study abroad. And of course, when World War I came, also these workers who would go there would also have the opportunity, in their spare time, studying in the evenings or whatever, to get an education in the West. And this included Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping. They were both, who were very close personally. I mean, they were like brothers. I mean, there's a saying, in China, you talk about somebody who's very close to you, not necessarily a blood relative. If he's older than you, he's your elder brother. There's a word for that, the guga, or if he's a younger one, he's the younger brother, and the Didi. So that this was the relationship that those two people had. Mao never went there. He never went abroad. So his view of the world was really concentrated to what he knew in China. And I think that really, he also had, as most intellectuals, had an acquaintance with the Confucian ideals, but it was really based in his peasant experience. And so you had this dichotomy, I think, within the Communist Party. You had those who were really attuned to what we call the diamat, that is, the philosophy that was characteristic of Marx and historical materialism. And you had others who had that because that was the official, philosophy of the Communist Party. But you had others who also had this Confucian background, which came to play sometimes a more important role in the way that they viewed society than even Marx and Lenin. I think it's also characteristic of looking at the role of Xi Jinping, which I won't go into at this point. Now, the orientation of the Communist Party in the beginning was to industrialize China. And this was really from the get-go. This was something, people, when Bertrand Russell went to China, he said, this is what you have to do. And of course, he said wonderful things about the Chinese, so that he was put on a pedestal there. But other people said, look, what Bertrand Russell said, this is obvious. This is what everybody knows we have to do if we're going to get out of this mess we're in. So it was also the orientation of the Communist Party. And of course, in the beginning, one of their only major allies was the Soviet Union. And they were like in lockstep for a long time. And it was through the Soviet assistance that they were able to begin this industrialization move. And it was done largely along Soviet models. And most of the education at the time, most of the industrial policy was done in direct collaboration with representatives from the Soviet Union, including like the scientists, the engineers. There were, literally thousands who came to China to help in this. And in the beginning, you had a problem. You had a problem right from the get-go in 1950, 49. The party was founded. 1950, they were talking about how to get the economy moving. And then you had the Korean War, which was, a whole other issue that we could go into if you wish. But that happened, so you had that in the middle of that. And that really threw a monkey wrench to a large extent in industrialization plans, because all the money had to go to whatever they could buy or produce for military purposes. But by the end of that war, they set up the first 5-year plan for, setting up the industries with this Soviet assistance. And by 1956, things were going fairly well compared to, all the figures showed the increase in production. Also in agricultural production was doing very well as well. And then something happened, and people got excited and saying, well, we can do more than this more quickly if we, kind of rely on the people and have them, move more quickly. So you had what became known as the Great Leap Forward, in which they kind of changed all the parameters of what was to be envisioned on the direction they were going to go and the speed with which they would achieve their goals. And it was doubled. And the idea was you put the initiative to the local communes and the local provinces, and they just, go like wildfire, to really get things moving. And unfortunately, you had this situation where when this was done, then of course all the people in the provinces and the local areas, they said, oh, we've got to really create a new Sputnik moment here. And so they took, and of course the heavy industrialization, was key, so that they would take, people from the countryside, bring them in to create, each little city or area would have their own power plants. They would have, their own production facilities, their own steel plants. And so you had this dispersal, on the one hand, a dispersal of these so-called industrial projects at the same time that you were denuding the countryside of its productive capabilities. And because this was understood to be the goal, people would often fudge the figures of what they were going to do, how much was being produced, especially in terms of the food supply. And this led to a major catastrophe. It was famine. I mean, it's probably hundreds of thousands of people who perished in this thing. There's an interesting book called Tombstone, which was written by probably a dissident Chinese, but with some accuracy with the figures of what happened. And of course, immediately this wasn't known, but as soon as it did become known, people looked and said, oh boy, this has got to change. So there was opposition raised to it. The initial reaction, I think, from Mao was to consider this a rightist deviation. People who want to go on the capitalist road are critical, but at a certain point it was clear that it was a problem, and at a certain point, and so that the policy was changed, and at a certain point, Mao even admitted that it's my fault. I was, the point person here. I pushed this, and it was wrong. Now that kind of discredited him quite a bit, and I'm sure he was very upset about this, although it was clear that it was his fault. And it's my impression that it was part of this which pushed him to, which gave him the impetus to support this even more disastrous cultural revolution, where they were making Mao into like the God, right? And so that's what you had. You also had the other problems that occurred at that time. The Soviets, of course, were very critical of this great leap forward, but they didn't want to upset the Chinese too much because this was the Chinese plan. But at a certain point, they began to voice their criticism, and the relationship between Mao and Khrushchev was not the best. Khrushchev admitted later on that he was probably a little too abrupt with Mao, not taking into consideration Chinese sensibility. But whatever happened, that led to a break between, I think, around 1960 is a key year between the Soviets and the Chinese. And all the Soviet advisors left. So, and that had its tremendous effect on the decay in industry, and trying to put things together again was not an easy call. So at that point you had, of course, then the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and it's really like the crazies took over. Actually, Mao just said, it's got to be cleaned up. He actually said that we have Khrushchev lying in our beds with us. That is, we have the rightists who are criticizing me who are with us, and we've got to clean it up. And so he, some middle school students went out and created the Red Guards, which became really the stormtroopers of this Cultural Revolution. Let me stop there for a moment. I don't know if you want, I can go on historically, but I just thought maybe you want to.
No, that's a very valuable sort of starting point. Cade, please go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts about, especially the last things you were talking about with the Cultural Revolution, is the role of Zhao and Lai.
Zhou and Lai.
Maybe like Zhou and Lai, thank you. The mediating force between kind of like certain like extremisms on both sides here and there, but I guess especially maybe like a tempering force with Mao. Both, I think he prevented Chiang Kai-shek's execution in maybe the late 20s, if I remember correctly, and then was a key figure in allowing certain modernizations to take place after the Cultural Revolution, if I remembering correctly, by protecting certain scientists and engineers who were, I think, vital for the satellite program that was to come out of that afterwards. And one thing I'm thinking is that when we're talking about from LaRouche's perspective, I'm thinking how, one space where LaRouche and Martin Luther King kind of line up is that long arc of history to a certain degree, or at least the power of, let's say, truth to win out at the end of the day, and how you see or you can hear in your description, there's certain forces like, Chiang Kai-shek's like reactionary executions of the communists in Shanghai, or I believe one contingency in Tsai Yuen-pei's university or research institute is where you also got like a certain Nietzschean element that was influential at the origins of the Communist Party and the May the 4th movement, that it seems like you can see both those things kind of go into their own reactionary circles and kind of fade away into history in the contemporary form of Xi's government, after the failure of it seems like another kind of Nietzschean revolt in the Tiananmen Square period, and sort of the failure of the government of exile, or whatever the Chiang Kai-shek sympathists tried to bring about throughout the 20th century. You can see kind of like the principles of the left, Kuomintang and Sun Yat-sen, and the influence of the American economy there, and Tsai Yuen-pei's sort of Schiller aesthetic education seems to be flourishing right now to a certain degree. And I don't know, it's just kind of a focus on certain figures like, please correct the pronunciation again, Zhou and Lai, or Sun Yat-sen, who somehow get beyond, say, nominalistic divisions and hit upon a certain principle of governance. And I guess I'm just wondering how it's sort of like that individual and then like the party structure interact, because it also seems like to me that there's something about the Chinese Communist Party that, though maybe especially in the Cultural Revolution, let's say its fetishization or its internal divisions led to catastrophe, it did seem like something of a bulwark against the program of balkanization that empire seems to take towards any sort of revolutionary area, both politically and geographically. That, of course, we saw throughout after the American Revolution, what was attempted to be done to America. And I don't know. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about what that form of the party does itself, and that sort of even, let's say, dialectic or something between an individual figure who, at the forefronts of it or against a certain maybe inertial tendencies, has to return to a kind of metaphysical principle or common sense, and then but how that structure kind of keeps itself going in a certain way against machinations on the outside.
Well, let me mention the story of Zhou and Lai, because as you say, he was a tempering force on Mao. Zhou actually had a more important role in the Communist Party than Mao in the beginning. Mao, of course, was not the major figure in the beginning of the formation of the Communist Party. There were others who were more close to the Soviet Union, who visited the Soviet Union, were trained there, who were in charge of the party. What Mao was, he was in charge of the program towards the peasantry, and it wasn't until the failure of many of these uprisings within the urban areas that it was clear that the so-called typical Soviet model was not going to be the decisive force in China, but that the peasantry was going to be most important. And it was at that point, that was clear that Mao, and Zhou Enlai was not in favor of that to begin with. But to the extent that it became clear to everybody that it was the case, then he, then became working with Mao. But then Mao was really the key figure, and Zhou stayed behind, him as a mover and shaker, but not as the decisive force. There's actually a new book coming out by Chen Jing. This will be in English. He's up in either in Harvard. Chen Jian, whom I know I've had some contact with for years, who's going to do a biography of Zhou Enlai. He did a tape on what was in the biography. I think this is going to be very fascinating. And his view is that Zhou always took this second stage, but nevertheless tried to shape the program through his personal influence on Mao, which in many respects he did. And ending the Cultural Revolution was probably one of them, was one of them. He himself was a target of the Gang of Four. He was being attacked. Their attacks against Confucianism also was an attack against Zhou Enlai. But he was never rejected by Mao. And at the point where it was clear that the program of the Cultural Revolution was leading to disaster in China, that he kind of took the reins transitionally in order to bring Deng Xiaoping back, who had also been in exile. It's an interesting figure. Something I wanted to say on that really slipped my mind. Well, the important thing, as you also mentioned, Cade, that even during this Cultural Revolution, I mean, even Mao was aware that, China was in danger militarily. I mean, you had Taiwan was still, attacking the Chinese coastal areas, and you had the United States there, and you had these instances, I think, in 1960, where Zhou Enlai went into first of all, the Communist Party initially knew this, and while they were working with the Soviet Union, they wanted to get nuclear weapons because the United States was a nuclear power, Soviet Union was a nuclear power, and they were a big power, considered themselves rightly a major power, and therefore should have them. The Soviets never gave them that technology, but at the point that they broke with the Soviets, they did do a crash course on developing nuclear weapons, and some of their people had been in Paris at the what do you call it, the Curie Institute, and Curie Joliot, I think, who was married to Eve Curie, gave them some of the information they needed, and they did have their bomb in 1964. But also, when Zhou went in to talk to Mao, saying the United States and the Soviet Union have and the British agreed to a nuclear weapons ban and atmospheric ban, and Mao said at that time that we have got to develop our own weapons. The same way with the space program, China in the 1970s had the thought of they had astronauts that they were recruiting, and they thought they would develop this program, but because of the economic conditions, there was just no money or possibility in doing it, so it was scrapped for another decade to do this. But during the period of even the Cultural Revolution, the people who were working on these things and working on Mao's program for the bomb program was called 2 Bombs and 1 Star. That is the hydrogen and the atomic bomb and the satellite. And the people, and therefore these scientists who were being harassed by the Cultural Revolution had to be protected. And so for military reasons, if for nothing else, and so that they were kind of taken out of the mix and had their own, operations, which was not affected directly by the Cultural Revolution. Well, not directly affected, but the Cultural Revolution did have an effect on them. Working under conditions of, they had pencils and pens, they probably had a few slide rules, but they didn't have anything else to work with, right? And they did a tremendous job in this thing under very, very trying conditions. On the space program, 2 of the top people who had designed the satellites, one who came from a landlord family initially. He was targeted by the Cultural Revolution, and he was tortured and he was killed. The other head of the program became so depressed and so demoralized that he committed suicide. I mean, that's what you had. But this was the generation, people like, our people know him, others don't know him, the father of the lunar program, Ouyang Zhiyuan, was one of these who was also targeted by the Cultural Revolution. And they lived through this, but they maintained their capabilities. They developed their capabilities to the point at which when this was all over, you had the kernel of the scientific cadre that could realize the program of the reform and opening up, and also the tremendous scientific program that we're working with today. Zhou Enlai was key in this. As I mentioned, the issue of industrial development was always there as a part of the Communist Party. But he made it more explicit first in 1965, which was, of course, still, right before the Cultural Revolution. He introduced what he called the four modernizations: industry, agriculture, science and technology, and defense. But it couldn't be implemented at that time, because then you had the Cultural Revolution and all the scientists and engineers were being, killed or harassed or sent off to the countryside. But at any rate, the ground had been laid. So by the time you were getting to the point of the end of the Cultural Revolution, Zhou Enlai again made a speech on the four modernizations, which then he died in 1976. Mao died shortly after him, and that was a whole new regime was there, and Deng Xiaoping had been placed as really the key figure to realize this program. And because you had this development within the military sector of these science and these scientific capabilities, they could begin to realize the program, and with the opening to the West, they could take off. And Zhou Enlai was key in this, and of course he, as well as Deng, but especially Zhou, had this Confucian background. I'd also say something about the role of Confucius, because sometimes people, don't have this clear. In the beginning, with the founding of the Republic, Confucianism in China was a philosophy, but it was also the state system. And the state system was always adopted by these outside forces like the Manchus and others who controlled China to maintain stability in China. And the Confucian system was a very rigid sort of system. Not because of Confucius, but because the Confucian, sayings had been made into some kind of, Aristotelian dogma. And that meant that you had to, the family was key. You had the key relationships were, I can't remember the four, between, your brother and to the family, and then to your clan, and so that you did what the family said you should do. But of course, all these people in, revolutionary China, they were going to overthrow the regime. And in one sense, they were also overthrowing this very rigid system, allegedly based on a notion of Confucius.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of, people anti-Confucian ideas at the time. But the effect, which was official, this was kind of official dogma. But the ideas of Confucius are embedded in the very language of China. And so it's there. You say, okay, we don't recognize it formally, but it's there in the way people see the world. And of course, over the period of time, it was reinstated within the Communist Party as a part, as it is today, as a part of this, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And among those characteristics are, of course, both Confucius and also, I might say, Sun Yat-sen. That's the program that he wanted has been pretty much realized by Xi Jinping. So that, what else do we want?
Well, let me bring in a sort of a follow-up to this question. What you're saying about the ossification of a Confucianist system, rigid system, this also is a story of Korea, because I've done some study of Park Chung-hee, and who took over, in a coup in 1961 in South Korea, basically taking over from what had followed with from the Syngman Rhee administration. And when he was growing up as a young man, he encountered that. There was this entire, and there was a fight against that to actually break out of the rigid system of the past and adhere to something, and use those principles. Really, you can see, to use those principles to industrialize, or to because if you have the outlook of the mandate of heaven, then I understand, which you referenced at the very beginning as being the way that the Communist Party gained its ascendancy, so to speak, or its legitimacy. It's that even in this feudalist system that they're fighting against, still the population has the conception of the mandate of heaven, of the general welfare, so to speak, of benevolence for the people being the standard for leadership. I think that's really fascinating. In fact, this whole problem of the Confucian method being turned into a rigid, dogmatic system, this is referred to in Schiller's essay, or Schiller's lecture on universal history, which we were reading last night with a group of people, when he discusses Christianity. He says, even our religion, so much distorted at the hands of the faithless, from which it has been handed down to us, who can deny the ennobling influence of a better philosophy in it? So even though it comes down in a distorted form, you still have the fundamental basis for a civilization has continued. And I mean, I'm very interested to look to walk. Schiller describes in that lecture a process of doing history, that you walk from the present back to the beginning, and then you come back. And I'm very interested in the fact that Helga LaRouche keeps on emphasizing the shared community of common destiny. Or if I have that right. It's always easy to trip over that one, but yeah. And
sometimes they shy away from the common destiny and shared future for mankind. But the word that is used, generally in Chinese is destiny.
Really?
And it's, I think it's appropriate. They just don't want people think we're taking off.
Yeah, right. No. I mean, the idea of the one mankind, right, which is represented in the actions of China towards Africa, just recently reported at the FOCAC meeting, and but the idea of the one mankind, when I try to take that backwards, to me that goes back to Confucianism. That is definitely a Confucianist outlook. It is not a Taoist outlook. It's not a legalist outlook. And it's coherent with the most beautiful conceptions of Western philosophy is not a good term to use. I'm totally against using that as an idea, but the best traditions of dating back to the Athenians. The idea of Nicholas of Cusa, that there's a coincidence of opposites, is the notion that there is a superior character to the one vis-a-vis the many, that there is a transcendental character which allows us to overleap contradiction, the opposites rather, not contradiction, but opposites, to be more specific, and attain into something more powerful than that. And, the whole sort of outlook of, or the mission of the LaRouche movement has been to say that it is possible for the governments of the world, for the leading figures of the world, and for humanity thereby to become self-conscious of that nature of the one, and then thereby, or to put it even more rigorously, into the idea of that we could identify with this Platonic method of hypothesis, and self-consciously not just industrialize, because we do need to industrialize. Of course, we need to do that, but that's not actually the goal. The goal is to advance the human creativity per se, to address the creative nature of man and establish that as the essential hypothesis of what humanity is, as opposed to the present dominant, at least certainly in the West, Malthusian conception of man, that man is nothing but an animal or a beast, which is actually coherent with Adam Smith. It's coherent with Sun Tzu and the legalist outlook. So that's sort of how I'm trying to think about this, is that we go backwards and we find that this is where we find the power, so to speak.
This is also, if you look at the development of how China has changed, it's interesting that one of the trips that Helga and I were on, she was interested in finding out who in China knows anything about Nicholas Cusa. And we found one professor in religion history, who seemed to be really the only authority on this issue. And he felt, somewhat frustrated too that, it wasn't more widely known. It just wasn't a big thing. You do, however, largely because of, the work of Tsai Yuen-pei, you do have this understanding of Schiller, right? And, and Tsai, it was clear also for Tsai that the idea, he wrote an essay on this, on aesthetic education, which I think was published in EIR, was very short, but the idea was that if you want to develop among the population a sense of moral character, that is a sense of willingness to sacrifice for the nation, and you have to have this sense of beauty which takes people out of their, everyday life, humdrum life, to a higher level where they can see their actions, on a larger perspective. And that's what he wanted to create. And this is well known. In fact, one of the, I came across an article some years ago on a very good article on aesthetic education, which was done by a scholar at the School of Marxism. So it's interesting that these things still link. Let me say something also about the relationship to us and to our ideas, to the extent that we know them, and there's a lot that's still unknown. Sure. The one thing that happened in terms of the transition, how people are changing also the view of Marxism, that when Deng Xiaoping, before he gave his famous speech introducing reform and opening up, he spoke to a group of scientists and engineers a few months before that, and he said to them, they had been, of course, targeted as being, antisocial grouping. He made them into a part of the productive forces. And he says, because science is a productive force, you are part of the productive forces of mankind. And he, of course, had to find a way of justifying this in terms of the traditions. And researchers found one instance in Das Kapital, or actually in the theories of surplus value. Marx had an idea of the economy, but, as Lin had pointed out in his early lectures, this idea of, the central role of technological innovation as the center of that was not clearly understood at all by Marx. I mean, it was ignored. But there was one instance in theories of surplus value where he talked about science as a productive force. And so Deng used that, okay, this is what it needs to be. So they were part of the mix now, and that changed things entirely. But when they started this, of course, when the reform and opening up, it was also not a clear pathway, and they were trying to figure out, how do we do it? How do you take really a top-down controlled statist economy, and how do you open it up in such a way that you don't, do damage? And so by the 1980s, they were actually inviting, economists. There was one famous meeting. They had a group of economists, including Milton Friedman. You had one of these guys from Czechoslovakia who, were doing the so-called goulash communism, which, they were experimenting with private industries. They would be there. James Tobin was in this group, and they all gave their ideas on, what was going to be done. This was in 1985. And they made some recommendations that really led to catastrophe. I mean, there was really kind of an opening up too wide, which really led to the whole Tiananmen thing. Was a result of the Zhao Ziyang, who was the premier, who loved to play golf. To give you an idea. Golf is now being forbidden by communist leaders. We don't want this. But he just really went too far on this thing, and the economy, inflation really took off, and it was a crazy situation. You had the kind of interventions that were being made among the young students by, the usual characters who wanted this color revolution. And that's what caused a lot of the turmoil. And after that, of course, there was a rethinking that we've got to do this a little differently. It can't just be. And of course, there was the fall of the Soviet Union, which also sent signals to the people that we've got to do something different than simply opening up to capitalism. But it was during this time, of course. Unfortunately, Lin was not at this meeting. He probably could have been, because even in the 80s, there was a lot of interest coming from China with regard to his ideas. He was giving by the late 80s. He was giving. That's my wife's phone. He was giving interviews, to People's Daily. There's a lengthy interview that Rick Sanders, one of my colleagues, found just recently, which was quite extensive on what China should do. But we don't know. So the word was out. He was also, at some point, to my knowledge, he was also going to be invited. This was after 1983, when Reagan made his famous speech, and of course, Lin's name was, very key there. So there was a great deal of interest in having him come, really, and talk about the SDI, because China was not involved in the SDI. It was the Soviet Union, and it was the United States. And there was a little bit of concern that if this works, if these two countries take off their economy, where does that leave us? So a couple things happened. One, I think, was that they really kind of increased the momentum in their science and technology programs, including the space program. And on the other hand, I think there was a greater interest in what Lin was saying. I mean, there was actually an attempt of bringing Lin, that I know from a rocket scientist, Chinese rocket scientist who passed away a few years ago, who said that they had extended an invitation to have Lin come speak. And it didn't work out, I think, for logistical reasons. And that's unfortunate, but it did indicate clearly that they were focused like a laser on some of the things that Lin was saying on this. And of course, we have a good friend, Ding Yifan, who's an old contact, who is at a very high level in the economics area, who had written a book on the knowledge economy many years ago, which was based on LaRouche's ideas, which he came into contact with when he was a journalist in Paris. And so you did have that input. Now, what happened, and we just don't know all the implications of that, but what happened was that not only did the reform and opening up put science and technology in the forefront, but it really became the motor force for the Chinese economy. And really, it's more than any other country in the world. That is really what Lin was saying. I mean, this has got to be your central focus. The innovation is the heart of everything else. And that's why they've been able to develop so quickly. And then, of course, you had the second influence was through the Belt and Road project, which was a project when the Soviet Union fell apart. You had all these other countries on China's borders, and they had to establish relations with them. And one of the things they, thought about was expanding the railroad that they had built through Xinjiang to take it to Kazakhstan. And so these things were kind of being done without a greater vision.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we found out, the interest of the Chinese in this project, which we were talking with the Russians on, they said, talk to the Chinese, they'd be interested in this. And we then had much more extensive discussions with them, and they were interested. And it led to that famous conference in 96 where Helga spoke. And the head of the Minister of Science and Technology was in charge of that. So that kind of laid other seeds with regard to what China could do abroad in what they call going global. And that then, I think, coalesced into Xi's Belt and Road initiative. And of course, as you mentioned, in the understanding of the role that Helga and the LaRouche ideas had in this project are very well understood in China. That they won't say that, Helga was the source of this,
Yeah.
But I mean, they're very clear that she was the person who was associated with this idea for many years, long before it was placed at the top of the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party.
If I could say, I mean, among other things, there's just a great coherence. I mean, no matter what, there's this tremendous coherence between our strategic outlook and the strategic outlook of the Communist Party. I mean, if you look, I follow a bunch of Chinese ambassadors on Twitter, and these guys are on point all the time on there's of course the only issue that I wish I could, have more effect, or, our movement can have, will succeed. We will succeed on this, there's no doubt, but is the question of CO2. But in general, I mean, there's just a profound, passionate commitment to the future of humanity, and a recognition that it's an understanding, it's a knowledge of the fact that the benefit of the other is my own benefit. There's not any question about that. That's not a position of one person or another. That's just understood to be effectively a scientific truth. That's what really impresses me about seeing the public communication of the Chinese diplomats, because I look around and the only other people who talk like that are us and maybe Putin, or not. I mean, I don't want to say maybe. Putin does for sure, and some other governments certainly take that approach. But politically, in terms of political forces in the United States, we are extremely important for the fact that we're upholding that standard. And it's very encouraging to see in the past year or so the response of Dr. Jocelyn Elders, Dr. David Satcher, the former U.S. Surgeon General and former head of the CDC, to Helga LaRouche's leadership and to the leadership of our organization generally. The response to this question of principle. Because then, considering what you said, you look at the Afghanistan situation and the idea of extending the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor into Afghanistan, and considering where we've come from what you were referring to in the mid-90s or the early 90s after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the sort of tentative efforts to do this kind of Sun Yat-sen style in infrastructure development abroad, and then you look where we are today, it just becomes very hopeful, maybe I can say, or it's easier to see how you can get a flip, so to speak, a real transition into a new geometry if these particular situations, like the situation in Afghanistan or in Haiti, were taken on with the same quality of mission orientation that we see the Chinese doing for their own country. One of the things you see on Twitter, Bill, is constant videos of China's like remarkable cities all across the country. I saw this funny tweet from this guy Carl Jha. Actually, I don't know how to pronounce his name precisely, but I think it's Jha, Z-H-A. And you should talk to him sometime, Bill. He should have a conversation with you. It'd be really good. But he's a pretty well-known personality. He's a Chinese guy who's living overseas in, I think, Malaysia. And he pointed out to one of these propaganda videos, the good propaganda of a city. I forget the name of it. He said, but it was this remarkable like drone footage of this incredible metropolis. And he said, I grew up in China and I've never heard of this city. And it's just grown up to, heights you never seen. So that's sort of, I see that there's this potential. And that's another reason why I think Cade and I in particular are really focused on the idea that American self-identified socialists or readers of Marx, for example, could do what you're describing the Chinese did, which is to say, and actually we read a 1980 document by LaRouche, which was the introduction to the Timaeus translation that was done at that time. It's basically a letter to the Soviets about, it's trying to create the basis for a discussion process with the Soviets in which Lin is emphasizing the conception of the, at the time he's talking about the Neoplatonic tendency, the city builder tendency. And he says in that document, which of course he changes his sort of approach to it later, that Marx and Lenin have effectively Neoplatonic roots, so to speak, and that the errors, specifically of Marx, he said you could largely forgive them because he was living within a complete sea of British intelligence operations, and that, expressed everything. But if you want to deal with this question of dialectical materialism, then you need to deal with dialectics, which means you need to deal with Platonism, and that if you were to do that, it's possible to do that. So, because if you do that, then you can do what the Chinese have done, so to speak, and you can do what LaRouche did and what our organization did in the 1980s when we adopted the American system, and went further, so to speak, by the 1978, I think. So, I guess the question is, what's blocking that? In a certain sense, this is when we're dealing with our own, organizing efforts. Cade, yeah, go ahead.
Because to make a rough musical analogy, especially with what's going on with, socialist movements in the left that are sympathetic towards China and the sort of overlap between the LaRouche's work and, current Chinese initiatives, it seems to me like we're in a moment of suspension without resolution, which creates a lot of creative excitement, I'd say. Because, and it seems to me like it's not like we can just, import the Chinese model right now. And I think that's maybe some of the failing of some of the vision on young socialists right now. It's just like, oh, let's have a communist party like China has a communist party, and from that get large infrastructure initiatives. And I think one of the great things about your work and the work of Michael Billington, who we interviewed earlier, it goes into kind of the complex history of China and how they got to the place now. It's not just the simple imposition of one form or another. So, like has been mentioned throughout this conversation, it seems like if we can bring up this question of hypothesis and Kusa and Plato, that also seems the place, like when we're in a general dialogue of cultures here, where I would say I don't think too much hubris, we have something still to even offer to the Chinese system at the moment, because it seems to me like LaRouche, I believe he wrote in The Science of Christian Economy, when he was talking about the American system of economy, he praised it, but said it still fell short of Plato's hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. So it had like its effective progressions, upon history and how it was able to intervene there, but still lacked that sort of absolute metaphysical basis. And I think we can see something similar in the successes of China right now. And, in the way that, it still is kind of a syncretic formation, the way it has the three traditions of Taoism and legalism, Confucianism, and there's a lot of, it seems like, internal and external diplomatic pragmatism. They feel like they have to, in some ways, have a lot of pressure to conform to and appease all at the same time. And sometimes it doesn't maybe hit this metaphysical principle where you get this idea of development as opposed to just sort of empirically seeing its outcomes. And that's why, I'm taking some inspiration from the history of, the NCLC, LaRouche's main organizing body, which I think at one point did become more of a philosophical organization than directly a political organization. And it seems like there is something like both how Tsai Yun-pei, saw the necessity of using an aesthetic education as well as with the scientific education and on industrial innovation, like as entwined at the hip. It seems like you do need, in my opinion, something like that, the metaphysical basis of like what we as a philosophical organization are able to bring in, week in, week out from this position of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, and not just because it seems like without that you can sometimes hit a blocking point where the question of what even development is maybe hits kind of a standstill. So even like looking out 50 years into the future, imagine something like the success of the Belt and Road Initiative globally, then you're at something with these large-scale infrastructure projects, you're going to have a different political relations between nations and the sort of cooperation that they need from there to there. I think even towards the end of LaRouche's life, he was writing about the sort of need to either go beyond the Treaty of Westphalia or even sort of have a new Treaty of Westphalia that takes into account the sort of what's owed to from one nation to another in the light of these large-scale infrastructure projects, and even in the mainstream sort of Western America. I think the inability to deal with that on a metaphysical level is the cause for a lot of this anxiety towards China, because when they see this sort of large-scale infrastructure project, all they can imagine is that, well, this is just how China's going to dominate the world then. That idea of win-win cooperation is sort of metaphysically blocked from what I see with people, because I think that we are in a moment where I think there's some still political creativity that is needed in order to really put out the new form. And I think the thought and actions of Xi Jinping are definitely going along this route. And I think more people need to join up with that to try and figure out with some sort of political creativity and imagination, what is the world going to look like in terms of these large-scale infrastructure projects, and especially then large-scale space exploration projects. It does call into question kind of the certain forms we've relied upon.
The key to this, I think, is that the United States has got to get back to its own traditions. The fact, as you mentioned, people look at I tell this to the Chinese all the time. The biggest problem is this inferiority complex that people have because we've destroyed our economy so much. That if we were in a better position economically, that if we felt that things were going pretty well here, you wouldn't have. China would not be used so much as a scapegoat, but you would see the relationship between the two. I was talking to a Chinese diplomat just recently, who's an old friend and very knowledgeable, but she's looking at the U.S. now in a different time and place than when she was here before. And I went through how the American economy, although it's free market capitalism now, originally based on the American system. That's what we have to get back to. And talking to her of the, how the American system works, she said, well, that's what we're doing now. And it's true, I mean, it's not that they had done, but they are doing that now. And the key is, and it's very serious because, most of the Chinese and the general attitude of the policy is that they want to get along with the United States. They see the United States as potentially their most important partner. But to the extent that begins to disappear, then there are other elements in China who will simply say, and some who say that today, that the United States is on its way down.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to become a failed state, and that therefore we have got to take the reign.
Mm-hmm.
And largely what happens in the United States will determine whether or not that kind of an attitude, wins out. We don't know what the effect of that would be. I mean, but the only thing that we can really hope to do is to get things back on track here, in terms of the science and technology. And also, look, if Biden would ever get this Build Back Better World thing going, and I can't see a possibility because of the Congress is not going to give the funding to it. The private industry is not interested in investing in Africa to any great extent. So what's that going to happen? But if something like that did happen, you would have the possibility of coordinating that with what has already been accomplished by the Belt and Road Initiative. And at one point, of course, when the BRI really began, even during the Obama period, there were people, here in the State Department and elsewhere who were interested in finding out more about it to see how they could work with it. And of course, you do have American firms working with it. You got Caterpillar, you have General Electric. I mean, there are a lot of firms involved in this. And that, I think the Chinese would be very, happy about this kind of thing. But to the extent that, that we can't or won't do that, and instead try and, undercut whatever they're accomplishing, it's going to be a conflict. It's going to lead to, a disaster. But I think we have the capabilities here because we do have that tradition. We did do this not too long ago, even during the SDI project. We did this kind of thing. And if we could get back to that, and people would begin to see China in a different light. Of course, before that, we've got to create all the possibilities we can have about creating relations between China and the United States on all different levels while this fight is going on the trade and all this other stuff, to try and get people to understand, the nature of what China wants. They want, and let me just say this from my own experience, is what they really want to do. They do want, as a major power, they do want to play a role in determining the future of mankind. They feel that the system as it now exists, and we're in total agreement with them, is totally unequal and is failing, has failed the large majority of humanity. And that something else has got to be done to create a system in which, it works in behalf of the people's livelihood, the people's benefit. And I think I said that I think it is something a lecture or something that I gave recently. I said it's important for the United States and China to find those areas where they could cooperate. But more importantly, it's important to find a unifying principle around which they can cooperate. And what I said is, because you have the people's livelihood is central to the Communist Party of China, the general welfare is the fundamental law of the U.S. Constitution. If both countries could orient towards that, that could be a unifying principle, and it could be expanded to a principle that benefits all of mankind, including Africa, Asia, Latin America. But that's the kind of thing that really has to be done, because we're, heading to a major problem here. It's what China is doing in terms of all the good that's being done is being undermined by the United States, and that's really got to change. And we don't do it by adopting, the communist system. We're not going to have that. Sometimes sometimes even the Chinese think that maybe if we get contacts with the Communist Party, this is going to help us in the United States. I just tell them, well, you don't want to work with the FBI. They're not trustworthy. But there are other elements. I mean, they are trying to do outreach. The new ambassador here in particular has been doing yeoman service, right? He's getting on every kind of site, the table tennis people in Houston now, the Flying Tigers in order to create those ties, those so-called people-to-people ties, which can be, the basis for resolving some of the problems at the higher level. And I think this is what we also have to think of doing more of. But more importantly, we have to, reinstitute this notion, of the four laws, which is the American system today, to try and get people to understand that this is the direction we have to go. Because if we get that, if the U.S. gets its mojo back, if it feels that it's confident, it's still advancing, we're advancing in science and technology, we will begin to cooperate with China. Because they're on that level, and we just got to get back there somehow, and not try and start a war with them, for God's sake.
Maybe it's good to take inspiration from the 2 bombs 1 star program. That maybe a crash program in science and technology can be just a few people and paper and pencil and straight edge in a basement.
That's good. We've been using pencil, paper, and straight edge. We've been doing constructive geometry, so we're like halfway there.
Yeah.
We can call it 0 bombs and a million stars. There's a lot more to discuss in depth, in my view, but it may be good to sort of wrap up here, and then we could arrange another time in the future to talk again. I want to...
We need a Burlingame deep dive for sure.
Oh, that would be so much fun. Yeah, that would be really fun. Why don't we... would you be willing to do that with us again, Bill?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. I'd be happy to do it. It'd be great.
Okay, great. But this has been instructive. I mean, I think that your approach is again, I think it's compelling that it's important to identify the mixed bag within the or sort of like what was going on at the beginning there at the what did happen from Sun Yat-sen to Mao Zedong and taking a look at this very heavy efforts by Morgan, by J.P. Morgan, by Lord Bertrand Russell, to try to, grip it and force the revolutionary efforts into their own outlook and a certain receptivity to that. I was reading this book, just snippets of it, called Dewey in China, which was recently published. And the person who wrote it, of course, loves Dewey, and so they write all the best things about how people responded to him. But they called him a second Confucius, and they wanted to basically have him replace Confucius. This is what a handful of individuals believed should happen. But his outlook is seductive. Because he says, well, the way that you know whether something is true is whether it improves, whether it has a practical effect that improves, life. Which is quite similar, in a certain sense, to what Lyndon LaRouche says. However, right, there's a crucial distinction, right, which is, first of all, what is your notion of the good and improving conditions of life? But also... the essential epistemology is the idea that you discover things through experience. And if you discover things through experience, discover, principles or ideas truthful ideas through experience, that is the primary source. Now, I think this requires a lot of discussion to actually get at it in depth. But then you will never attain unto a new era in world history in which has never happened before. Because it's all on the basis of trapping humanity into existing axioms and presumptions about the nature of the universe, like utilitarianism, which is what Dewey was essentially promoting, and certainly Russell even worse. So those are, to be able to bridge that gap, to take people who are sort of seduced into an appealing outlook and to maintain their passion and devotion to the general welfare, to the industrialization of the United States, to the benefit of the people who are suffering across the world from the actions of our government, to reverse those things, to maintain that passion in a gung-ho spirit. That's something, but also to give people the epistemological tools to bridge that, to acknowledge what is false and what is true. This seems to me a great task that we have.
Absolutely. I think also in the dialogue with China is to try and engage them on the issues of the overriding philosophical problems, especially around the notion now that aesthetic education has been introduced as the policy. It's also kind of, for us, I think, a foot in the door to try and talk about the overriding issues as it's expressed in Schiller's work in particular.
Cade, do you want to say? Go ahead. Pardon me.
Because there's a lot to be done on in the so-called philosophical realm, with all the articles on Bertrand Russell and Nietzsche. Nietzsche is also, Lu Xun was a follower of Nietzsche, and he's recognized as the top. He wrote the first books in class in colloquial Chinese, which is important. But I mean, those philosophical trends are still there, and could at a certain point, of course, cause a problem. I think the general dynamic is moving in the right direction, but it's also, I think, a situation in which we have the capability of creating an entirely new dialogue with them. I think with with Cousé's notion of the coincidence of opposites, which probably is Cousé not being very well known in China, but because Helga's getting publicity on this introduces another factor in which this discussion can go on with regard to what is the coincidence of opposites.
And if I could just say my final piece with one thing there, kind of tying both those together, I think that's exactly where we could have the most mutually beneficial intervention, especially given the history of the unity of opposites for Hegel going through Mao's theory of contradiction that's still kind of applied in the contemporary, theoretical end of the Chinese Communist Party at least. But I think a perfect example to kind of highlight the difference between that unity of opposites and the coincidence of opposites would be exactly on this question of Dewey's learning by doing, which then was applied by Mao in the Cultural Revolution, and how we're not then just advocating a reaction to something like just the rote learning of repetition, and it's actually through a coincidence of those opposites, where they coincide in a one as opposed to just coming into a new historical form. It's still there's a metaphysical principle here where it's LaRouche's learning by rediscovery, where it's not just going through the formalized repetition of what's there, or by just haphazardly empirically jumping out into the world, but through the rediscovery of classical breakthroughs in the conception of the universe. That's where you get to the point to make your own, in that process of rediscovery. And even Hegel, in his notion of Begriffene Geschichte, says basically the same in the phenomenology. So I'm very much in agreement of that being a focal point of engagement.
Bill, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much, and we'll figure out another chance soon.
Great, my pleasure. Thank you.